everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and we're going to talk about Titans, and I'm going to do a full review covering both seasons of the show so far. Now, the show did broadcast a while back, so I've only just managed to recently catch up with it on Netflix. I've just binged the show for the last couple of days and I've managed to get through both seasons now, so I thought I'd just do a combined overall summary of what I think of the show and both seasons overall. Now, there will likely be spoilers in this review, so just in case you haven't caught up yet with the entire show, you can catch up with all of the episodes. I think they are currently broadcasting on Netflix at the moment, so if you don't want to be spoiled yet, catch up with all of the show's episodes and then come back to this overall review. Now, Titans, of course, is a live-action produced superhero show based on the classic DC superhero team, the Teen Titans. The show was created by Aviva Goldsmith, Jeff Johns and Greg Berlanti. Now, Titans debuted on the DC Universe streaming platform back in October the 12th, 2018. Season 1 had 11 episodes and Season 2 consisted of 13 episodes. Season 3 is due to debut on HBO Max on August the 12th, 2021. Now, the Teen Titans have been a long-standing comic book property of DC for many years now. They have appeared in many interpretations and versions. Now, for many, the most recognisable versions was the Cartoon Network animated series from 2003 to 2006, consisting of the primary characters Robin, Starfire, Cyborg, Beast Boy and Raven. Now, that show itself was very much praised for its bright, energetic, quirky tone. It would mix it in with more serious tones as the group took on big antagonists such as Deathstroke and Trigon. Now, the TV series took a far different approach. Here they adopted an R-rated tone that was far more grounded, darker, infinitely more violent with foul language and elements of sex and drug use as well. That has very much become the norm for the last couple of years in terms of television series. We've seen this recently with the likes of The Boys, Doom Patrol and Invincible as well. Now, as knowing the Teen Titans, for me, much more from the animated series, when I initially saw the trailers and footage from the first season of the show seemed very unappealing to me, which is why I didn't watch it initially upon its release. Now, I think this was the same for a lot of people who were indeed fans of the animated series, and also there was an interpretation from the comic books which showed these characters in a much more brighter, optimistic tone. There was also much controversy in terms of the overall look of the certain characters, in particularly the Starfire representation, of course, any controversy when you race change a certain character, and many people weren't excited by the overall look and tone from the trailers. They said it looked very weak in terms of its budget and looked very cheap in terms of the overall aesthetic of the particular characters. Now, from my perspective, having now watched the show, my take on it is that whilst there are areas of potential, and the episode narrative itself is quite strong in terms of how they plan each story arcs, each individual episode flows along quite nicely. But I think Titans is a show, it falls down primarily because it's set in very much on a very grim and nihilistic tone. The very over serious and heavy-handed approach of the show, it doesn't make it as entertaining. Now, we look at Gotham, for example. That was the Fox show, that was the Batman prequel. Now, that too was very violent at times, but that had a much more of a pulpy, outlandish, entertaining feel to it. So whether you could take it seriously or not, Gotham seemed to have much more of a better sense of its own idiocy in many ways. So I think that what made it a far more watchable show. But Titans doesn't have that same luxury. It really takes itself super seriously, as I mentioned before, and whilst that brings a certain intensity and credibility, you wouldn't want the show to go too much the other way and be too cheesy or campy. No, you wouldn't want that. But I think it just lacks a certain charm, and as I mentioned before, the show's limitation in terms of its budget and effects were all too apparent at times. Now, in terms of the overall seasons of the show, the series stuck to the primary core characters from indeed the animated series and the comic books as well. They weren't quite called the same stage names. So we look at season 1 overall, and as I mentioned before, it started off very grim and bleak. We primarily centered on Rachel, which is the show's equivalent to Raven, as I mentioned before, and in the beginning we see her really struggling to come to terms with the dark, intense powers that lie within inside her. We opened up the episodes with her seeing her mother getting killed, and then she goes on the run, and she really harbours a lot of intense powers filled by outrage, and she struggles to contain this, and this would be something that would stay with the character certainly throughout the whole of the first season. Now she goes on the run and is pursued by multiple people and is eventually helped by Detective Dick Grayson, who we all know is the Robin identity, and he has broken away from working with Batman. He still adopts the Robin persona, attacking criminals at night, and this was another very controversial scene from the trailers when we saw him attacking certain vigilantes and then he says F Batman, and that again put a lot of people off because they felt that Robin would never adopt that kind of saying or attitude towards Batman. But going ahead with this season, through the escapades together, both Dick and Rachel, they meet up various other members of the Titans. So the first member was Gore, who they met when he was part of another superhero team known as Doom Patrol, who eventually got their own show as well. Gore has very much of shape-shifting powers. We see him multiple times changing into tigers primarily as well, although he can change into other animals. The other main character, of course, is Core, who we see can exhibit large blasts of solar energy. This is, of course, the Starfire character, and we later on find out throughout the season about her alien heritage. So as Dick assembles the current Titans of the show, we later on learn that there was a previous team of the Titans, and we get the original members consisting of Hawk and Dawn, and Donna Troy also makes an appearance as well. And Donna Troy is a very famous character. She's essentially the Wonder Girl of this show. As we all know, she's an Amazonian coming from Themyscira. Now, season 1 did have very much of an even tone as we followed the original members and the new members assembled together. I did like the backstory of Dick Grayson, and of course through that we got multiple references to Batman, and they did hinge on that, I think, too much as well, especially when we talk about the finale episode. Now, you're always going to get this with Batman related shows, despite the fact that they try to be a standalone show, they constantly refer back to Batman throughout the season, and again, I think that was a weakness within the show. I was never a fan of the representation of Stargirl or Core. Again, another needless race change, as I mentioned before. Now, the actress wasn't bad in the role, but I just think the character herself didn't have quite that sweet lookability or that innocence, naivete that we associate Starfire throughout the show. They kind of made her not a prostitute, I would say, but she's far more of a sexualized character in terms of her attitude and her demeanor, and I didn't see really the chemistry between her and Dick that they have. It's very much more of a sexual relationship. Now, the show has kind of done away with that, so they sleep with each other early on within the show, and there's no further hints in terms of their romantic relationships. Now, this follows where we got a very much of a Hawk and Dove centric episode where we saw the original origins of how they got together. Originally, Hawk had his brother, and they were adopting the Hawk and Dove identities because they got in trouble in college and then they got suspended, and then later on through an accident, very implausible I would say, we saw the death of both Dawn's mother and Hank's brother, and then over the course of the incidents we see them coming together in terms of their grief, and then that's when they got together. So it was a bit confusing with the timeline because we had multiple episodes where 1 minute she's with Hank and then the next minute she's with Dick, and it didn't really quite establish that very well in terms of who was with who, but that wasn't really the main core of the storyline. Now, 2/3 of the way through the season, the team do separate. This is because they eventually track down the main people who were tormenting certain members of the team, and they managed to destroy the mental facility where they were experimenting on certain people with special abilities. So that was kind of the mission of the Teen Titans done, and they separated for a while, and I think this took away a lot of the momentum and the energy away from the show, and I think this led to a sloppy build up in terms of the finale. We found out Corey's true alien heritage, and then we found out that she had to go and destroy Rachel because she was the gateway for the emergence of Trigon, and Trigon himself wasn't very convincing at all in terms of his CGI rendition. You know, a lot of people give the CW shows a flack, but this was very low budget style in terms of Trigon's appearance. He just didn't have that much of a threat level, and he's pretty much done away with in the opening for season 2. But in terms of season 1, I just felt it was very uneven by a lackluster finale, which really seemed to center much more on Batman, which was frustrating. We had this alternate reality where Dick Grayson was having this dream because he was under the dark influence of the Trigon powers. We spent too much time on this Batman narrative where he's gone rogue and he's killing off the famous criminals, and Dick Grayson has to fight him off again, and I just think it was too much pandering towards Batman, and we saw very much elements of that towards the first season as a whole. We then go on to season 2, and I think overall was much of an improvement over season 1, but still had major issues. Now, the best feature of season 2, no doubt, was the introduction of Deathstroke as the main villain, and I think for the most part they handled this character really well. I liked the backstory a lot with his son Jericho. When we saw Deathstroke in the beginning, he was taken in and he was experimented on, and he developed powers, and he eventually passed on those powers to Jericho. Jericho has the ability to essentially body snatch people. He can come out of his spirit and take over people's bodies, and Deathstroke himself was really built up as a true threatening force, superior as a fighter to all of the Titans, and the performance was very well played by actor Esai Morales. Now, many of you may not remember, I vividly remember him from NYPD Blue. His role was the Chief Lieutenant, still one of the greatest cop shows of all time, and they really typically painted Deathstroke as much more of a sympathetic portrayal. We had a very sound motivation as why he wants to work against the Titans, and they did build up a lot of the angst and the antagonism between the group and Deathstroke overall. And I always say at the time, if you're going to make a dominant villain throughout a series, you have to make him truly a big threat that pushes the heroes to strive as hard as possible in order to defeat him. So in terms of that aspect, I think they did the Deathstroke character very well. Now, we linked Deathstroke's role with the emergence of another character, and that was Rosa Wilson, who was Deathstroke's daughter by another woman that he slept with, and she has regenerative abilities, and she wasn't quite as layered as I think Deathstroke was as a character. For the most part, she's very angry initially as what Deathstroke did to her, and we find out later on throughout the season that they originally had planned together to infiltrate the Titans so Deathstroke could really take apart the team from the inside. Now, Rose had developed a semi-relationship with one of the big characters as well from this season, and that was of course Jason Todd. Now, if you know anything about your comic books, you know Jason Todd was the next Robin, and of course he was a big character in one of the most famous Batman's storylines, The Death in the Family, and he would go on of course to adopt the Red Hood identity. Now, Jason Todd comes in, I think it's around about the end of the 4th episode where Dick is in trouble. We established that Jason Todd was working with Batman, and Batman has sent him over to Jason to try and get him to learn the ropes and really harness in a lot of his rebellious tendencies. Now, he's much more of a precocious, rebellious and impulsive character. Maybe they instilled a lot of the Damian Wayne personalities from the comics into this character, but sadly I didn't really like Jason Todd as a character, and he didn't really become a pivotal role as the season went on. The other major character throughout season 2 was Connor, and this was essentially a Superman clone fusing Superman's powers together with Lex Luthor's DNA. We get the introduction of the famous Cadmus organization. We all know this is a secret black op organization. We've seen it interpreted multiple times through comic books and animated shows, and we see Connor breaking out of the Cadmus facility, and we really dedicate a whole season in terms of his overall origin. He's supported very much as well by his dog Crypto, who also has superpowers. And we see at the end of the 4th episode where he saves Jason Todd from falling down the building, and for the most part he builds a relationship primarily with Gore throughout the episode, where we see a conflict of tones of him trying to embrace his superhero identity in terms of helping people, but he makes a lot of mistakes and he uses his force excessively. This gets him in trouble a lot with the police force, and he finds himself a lot on the run, and this is where Gore tries to protect him overall. So in terms of the visualization of Connor, in terms of the comic book interpretation, I thought they did a good job, but I didn't really see him as overall an essential piece of the overall dynamic involving the Titans, and I think they focus on his character too much at the expense of other members of the Titans. Corey, we see another being of her alien heritage come down, and he warns her of her sister has basically taken over the rule of their race and she's hunting her down. And again, this really didn't feel important in terms of the overall season, and Corey herself kind of drifts in and out of the narrative, same as Rachel. We get a repetitive beat of again her struggling to come to terms with harnessing her powers overall, and she didn't seem quite as important as what she was in the season 1. Both Hawk and Dove, they weren't as successful as to me in this second season. There was too much repetition in terms of them getting together, breaking up, going away to a quite secluded place and then coming back to the Titans, and they repeated that beat 2 or 3 times overall, and you just wonder yourselves, are these two really destined to be together? They have to keep them together because of the whole Hawk and Dove association, but the relationship doesn't really feel true or genuine overall, and I think they've really got to try and find more interesting aspects for them both going ahead for season 3. If anything, Dove had much more of a connection with Dick, and we see multiple times throughout the season when she's having a go at Dick or criticising him in terms of how to handle the team. Now, Donna Troy was an interesting element throughout this particular season. She has a major part, of course, in the whole Deathstroke arc, because we learn, given a flashback episode, that she had a one-night stand with Aqualad, a member of the team, and he ends up being killed by Deathstroke after he was trying to assassinate one of the main Themyscira leaders. We had a back and forth again where Donna was destined to go back to Themyscira, but she didn't want to. Now, she was very well played throughout this season, but I had certain issues in terms of her fighting abilities and her power levels, because we see halfway through the season she's badly defeated by Deathstroke in a one-on-one battle, and that didn't really make sense because she's an Amazonian. She's not going to have the same power levels as Diana, we understand that, Wonder Woman, but she's still going to be very much strong, and in general perception the Amazonians tend to be much more stronger, skilled fighters than the normal humans, so she shouldn't have been bested by Deathstroke in this battle, and she's literally taken to the point where she could literally die. And again, I wondered why Deathstroke didn't kill her in this overall encounter. This very much proved confusing when we get to the season finale, when she's taking punches from Connor, yet somehow she's able to be defeated by Deathstroke. So that didn't make sense overall in terms of her character. Now, there were issues with Dick because we see him struggling with what happened within his first encounter with Deathstroke. We get a revelation when the team were using Jericho as a decoy to try and find the locations of Deathstroke. Revelation after revelation result in a one-on-one encounter between Dick and Deathstroke, and this results in the death of Jericho. So that was quite an emotional hype, but in terms of Dick himself, they really didn't give him much focus because he was the original assembler of the Teen Titans, but frustratingly he's constantly running away, doing things on his own. We had this weird dynamic when he's having strange visions of Bruce, who is talking back to him all the time. We have very laughable scenes when he goes to a strip joint and we see Bruce dance with the other strippers, just taunting him all the time. Yeah, I didn't really find that very appealing. I found it very confusing, just a bit weird in terms of watching it overall. There was a very illogical turn from Dick when he reveals what happened in terms of Jericho's death to the other Titans, and again they separate just like they did in season 1, and then for some reason he decides to implicate himself and put himself in jail by attacking other police officers, and this made no sense really. We understand Dick is depressed because of what happened, but it made no sense to me to put him in jail, and it wasn't very clear either how exactly he broke out. I quickly have to mention, of course, the interpretation of Bruce Wayne. Now, this is played by Ian Glenn, who we primarily know, of course, from playing Dormont from Game of Thrones. Now, I like Ian Glenn as a character, so it's nothing against him, but I didn't like this fact that they made Bruce Wayne much more of an aged character. That didn't make sense because in this world that they've established, Batman is still very much of the crime fighter within Gotham. Okay, they had elements where Batman went away, of course, that made sense because they had to clear the way for Robin and the Teen Titans to be more proactive throughout the show, but I just didn't like the fact that they went for a much more aged version of Bruce Wayne. It doesn't make sense. Now, I just cannot envisage seeing Ian Glenn in the Batman costume. Now, they may pull that narrative in season 3, or indeed we get a season 4, but I just felt it was a very strange choice to have much more of an aged Bruce Wayne in terms of the show overall. So I think as long as they keep him Bruce Wayne and they don't focus on him too much in season 3, they shift the focus back on the Titans, then maybe it won't be too much of an issue overall. So in terms of season 2, as I mentioned at the start, much more of an improvement, but I think it still had issues in terms of its narrative structure. We kept going flashbacking back and forth in time overall, and that was a bit disorientating in terms of the viewing experience. And in terms of the finale, they made a very bad choice in essentially eliminating the threat of Deathstroke way too early in his fight encounter against Nightwing and Rose. Now, I did like the Nightwing costume. I thought that was spot on. I mean, to be honest, it's not too hard of a costume to really get right, or get wrong rather, but I liked how they visualized the costume. It did look very good, but Deathstroke was defeated too easily. Yes, I understand he was a bit weary when we caught up with him later on. When Dick goes to see him again, that didn't make sense either. Why he had to constantly feel the need to go and see Slade Wilson. And we had certain scenes where Slade Wilson was a bit physically incapacitated, so he wasn't quite the peak Deathstroke as what he was earlier on in the season, but I think that just really undercut the character overall, how he was defeated so easily. And they shifted the focus, as I mentioned before, on battling Connor, and again that didn't really make sense. And of course the pivotal moment throughout the season was the death of Donna Troy, which I think was a shame because I felt she was a very good character overall, very good engaging presence within the show overall. And from what I can tell from the season 3 trailer, I think it's quite a permanent death we see at the end, where they take her body away back to Themyscira, and Rachel goes back with them as well, and the Titans progress as a further crime fighting team. Quite a large roster overall, so I wonder if they will trim that down going ahead for season 3. Maybe that's why they got rid of Donna, because they knew they were going to expand much more on the other characters, so we'll wait and see overall. So in terms of the show, like I said, it's got potential. It's tapping very much into the lore of the comic book material. We're seeing a whole host of characters, and again, going by the third trailer, we're going to see that very much continued, because we're going to see an adaptation, of course, of the Death in the Family storyline. We're going to see the emergence of Red Hood. I wasn't convinced by that face mask at all, so they need to work on that. We're going to delving much more into classic Batman villains, in particular the Scarecrow. We saw the inclusion of Barbara Gordon as well from this show, so maybe that's why they killed Donna, because they had to trim down the ever expanding cast as well. So we'll see how they develop that going ahead for the third season overall. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, I just think in terms of a show, it does have potential. It takes itself seriously, it takes the characters seriously to a certain point, but it's not as appealing because of this grim, dark, deconstructive take on certain of the characters within the role. Now, I've got enough investment where I'm at least interested to see how they would take the show going ahead for season 3, so I'll wait and see what happens in that. There's been a very lukewarm reception overall in terms of the series. I think it's even viewed in less estimation than the CW shows have, which, you know, is quite a statement. I mean, depending on where you are in terms of the CW show. So we'll wait and see if season 3 can really breathe new life and new enthusiasm into Titans overall. But I just thought I'd wrap up this overall series review of the show in terms of the 2 seasons so far. Has potential, but too heavy-handed in terms of its grim, dark tone and unnecessary and over-the-top violence. But despite that, I will at least watch the season 3 when it premieres, and as usual, I will do a premiere episode now that I've caught up with the show. And if the show continues to see an improvement, then I will persist and carry on with the show going ahead throughout its 3rd season. So those are my thoughts and feelings on Titans in terms of its 1st and 2nd season and how it is as a show overall. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think season 3 will be an improvement, or have you written off the show now? Do you find it very weak? Were you put off by a lot of the limitations in terms of the action sequences and the CGI as well? Do you think it's riffing too much on classic Batman villains and you think it should branch out and be its own individual show overall? Do you think certain characters of the Titans are getting sidelined in terms of pandering of more classic characters such as the Superman clone and Batman as well? Let me know what you think in the comments, what you think about the show. Please also hit and like those subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality and content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.